Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Dragon Age, Tevinter Nights. Edited by Chris Bain, Patrick Weeks, Matthew Goldman, and Christopher Morgan. Narrated by Gildart Jackson. 3 Trees to Midnight. Patrick Weeks. Mirian of Ventus didn't know much about Qunari. Until last week they had been an annoyance, something young soldiers went off to fight, while everyone else grumbled about the taxes they paid to defend the Imperium from the savage Oxmen. That ignorance had ended in a blast of cannon fire, and in less than a day Ventus, jewel of the Tevinter Imperium, had fallen. The Qunari had cut down anyone wearing armor. Those who were unarmed they had herded into different groups. The women, children, and elderly had quickly returned to their homes. The mages had screamed horribly as alchemical concoctions killed their minds, and left them as empty husks who stumbled along, sweeping dirt from the streets with awful vacant stares, their beautiful gold-trimmed robes dragging in the dirt behind them. The men, however, had been put into work camps. The afternoon sun was blinding after days down in the hold of the Qunari ship. Mirian squinted, his chained legs rattling as he shuffled along in the line of prisoners. The sandy beach gave way to grass, and shortly thereafter to forest, where a dense cloud of black foliage hunkered over twisted green tree trunks, as though preparing to lash out at the weeds below. "Vishanti Kafas," Mirian muttered. The Qunari bastards had taken them to the outskirts of Arlathan Forest. The last of the prisoners were off the ship now, and shirtless Qunari roared at them to line up, waving swords that looked like they could chop through a horse with no appreciable difficulty. Finally, a Qunari, even larger than the others, stepped forward. His face was twisted into a scowl, his grey skin painted gold with red slashes, and his armor was a mass of knotted rope twisting around jutting spikes. His horns were jagged and swept forward to either side of his face like a low helmet. One horn had been chopped off, probably in battle, and replaced with steel. "Baas," he called, his deep voice sending a shudder through Mirian's gut. "That is what you are. Baas. Things. You do not know what is and is not. You need the guidance of the Qun to learn." "How generous of you," muttered the prisoner who had been in front of Mirian, a tall man whose accent placed him as from the south. Mirian kept his head down. If the Qunari were going to single out someone for back-talk, it wouldn't be him. "I am Bastar, keeper of Bas," the Qunari leader went on. "You belong to me now. Work and you live. Resist and you die. Run." A slow smile twisted across his face. "And you belong to the hunt, master." He gestured at another Qunari warrior, this one dressed in lighter armor, strips of leather and drake's scale bound by crisp red ropes. His face was painted with stripes of black and white. His cold stare swept down the line of prisoners as Bastar went on. "Run, and he will track you down, and you will suffer, as the mages of Ventus suffered." Mirian felt the panic rising up in him and fought it down with a conscious effort, clearing his mind and keeping his body still. When he was certain he could look up without giving himself away, Bastar had moved on. "You will take axes, you will cut the trees. Prove you are useful and obedient, and you will one day earn a place in the Qun." Bastar looked across the line of prisoners, then let out a snort. Come. Mirian glanced nervously at the huntmaster, but the Kunari tracker had walked back to the ship. Kunari guards came forward, carrying massive chests between them, and dropped them to the sand. As Mirian drew closer, he saw that the chests were filled with wood axes, heavy and clumsy, sharp enough to fell a tree, but too clumsy to be much use in a fight. Each prisoner got one, and as he did, he was released from the long prisoner's chain. The prisoners weren't released fully, though. Before they were freed from the prisoner's chain, they were shackled into pairs, each pair connected at the ankle by a length of chain no longer than Mirian's forearm. Only a pair of circus performers could run while tied together like that. Before Mirian knew it, he and the prisoner in front of him were at the front of the line. The other prisoner stepped forward, back straight and shoulders square under his brown labourer's tunic. His hair was silver, Mirian noted, and revised the other prisoner's age up a few decades. "Right," said the prisoner, holding out a calloused hand to the guard standing over the chest of axes. "Off to work, then." And as he turned, Mirian saw the points of the man's ears. An elf. That explained everything. Mirian's mouth twisted into a sneer as the Kunari handed the elf the axe. Any elf in Ventus would have been a slave, so of course he'd have no loyalty to the Imperium, no understanding of what Tevinter had protected him from all these years. He'd probably laughed as the soldiers had been cut down, the mages poisoned, happy to trade one master for another. "Filthy knife-ear," Mirian muttered, glancing at the elf, unaware that the words had worked themselves free from his mouth, until the elf and the Kunari guard stared at him. The elf was the first to recover. "Lazy Shem isn't used to working," he said with an easy smile. "Not with those soft hands of his. Chain me to another elf, so I don't embarrass the poor man." "You'd embarrass me with your knife-eared stupidity," Mirian snapped, "and then stab me as soon as my back was turned." "Quiet!" the guard roared. "There will be no disruptions." He spoke slowly. Most of the Kunari didn't speak trade well, Mirian remembered. "Then chain me to a man, not this knife-ear," Mirian said, glaring at the silver-haired elf. "Probably faster for everyone if you do it," the elf added. "The humans of Ventus are an ugly lot, and they only care for their own." The guard hesitated for a moment, but then a booming voice startled them all. "No!" They all turned to see Bastar stomping over from another line of new prisoners. There were prison ships landing all along the beach. He glared at the guard, who shrank back, and then smiled at Mirian and the elf. "The Bass must learn. There are no more elves, no more humans. There are only Bass, who must work to prove themselves worthy of serving the Kuan." He turned to the guard. "Chain them together. Let them learn to work as one." "As you say, Bastar," the guard murmured, and brought out a chain. He clapped one cuff around the elf's ankle, snapping it shut, and then turned to Mirian. Helpless, Mirian stepped forward. The cuff was cold on his right leg, pinching his tender skin as it snapped shut. "As you say, bastard," the elf said with an obedient smile. The big Kunari looked at him, then nodded and strode off, ready to give orders to another line. Mirian let out a shaky breath as the guard undid the prisoner's chain and slapped a wood-cutting axe into his hand. He glared at the elf. "You could have gotten us killed." "Was that Shem?" the elf asked, his face a mask of innocence. These old knife ears aren't as sharp as they used to be, and sometimes I hear things wrong." "Go now and cut the trees," the guard said, pointing to the forest. Miriam saw that other paired prisoners were already at the edge of the wall of green, hacking away. "Work well, and you will eat well." The elf started off, and Miriam stumbled as the chain jerked against his ankle. The elf looked back. "Come on, Shem," he said with a little grin. "Try to keep up." Miriam and the elf found an awkward rhythm after a few strides, keeping pace so that the two legs chained together moved as one. Miriam's legs were longer than the elf's, and he had to shorten his steps. "You keep running your mouth like that, you'll get killed," Miriam said as they made their way across the grass, the chain hissing between them. "You're still a slave, idiot. Only now you're a slave to beasts that will kill you as soon as look at you." "What would you know about it?" the elf asked. His voice wasn't friendly any more, and when Miriam looked over he saw that the elf was looking ahead at the forest. "You're no labourer, whatever tunic you wear." Miriam's breath hitched, and his grip tightened around the axe he carried. "You don't know what you're talking about, elf." "Strife," the elf said. "What?" "There's more than one elf around here. Call me Strife, and I know what I'm talking about better than you, I'd wager." Strife, if that is what he wished to call himself, still wasn't looking at Miriam, squinting instead into the trees ahead of them. "The loose tunic hides your belly, but those nice rounded forearms say that you haven't missed many meals. And you keep your head down out of fear, not habit." Miriam jerked his hands back up into his sleeves. "At least I keep my head down at all." They came to a stop as the grass thickened into waist-high weeds. On either side of them, other pairs of prisoners had already started chopping at the trees, the dull thumps of their clumsy blows echoing through the air. "What kind of stupid knife-ear calls the head guard a bastard?" "One who wants to know how much trade the head guard speaks," Strife smiled. "Now we know. Enough to talk to us, not enough to get nuance." "What kind of slave talks about nuance?" Miriam snapped. Strife stepped to the tree closest to them, a blunt, ugly thing whose trunk was so thick that Miriam couldn't have reached his arms around it. "Guards are watching, Shem. Probably want to start chopping." He stepped to the tree and swung his axe with casual strength, his blade biting into the bark. "Miriam, elf. There's more than one Shem around here." He stepped up, looked at the tree a bit uncertainly, hefted his axe, and swung. The blade hit at an angle with a jolt that sent pins and needles up Miriam's arm, and he winced, dropping his axe. As it thudded into the soft turf, Strife burst out laughing. "Now there's a man who's never done a day's hard work in his life. What were you, Miriam, before you put on those labourer's clothes to hide from the Kunari? A merchant? A petty noble? Miriam was moving before he realized, and his fist smacked Strife in the face. The elf stumbled back, his smile gone and his face going red with anger. "Shut your mouth, you damned knife-ear!" The smile was back a moment later, though, and the elf sank his axe into the soft turf and clenched his fists. "Why don't you make me, Shem?" Miriam came in with another swing, but this time the elf stepped into the blow and caught it on his tucked-up arms. It was like punching a thick rope, and Miriam's knuckles stung as he tried to step back, then stumbled as the chain reached its limit and nearly tripped him. A sudden flash blossomed into pain, and Miriam staggered from a blow he hadn't even seen coming until it cracked across his face. In the distance he heard yells and shouts, but then Strife punched him in the gut, and Miriam sank to his knees as the air whooshed out of him. "Isn't that just like Tevinter?" Strife asked, standing over him. From the corner of his eye, Mirian saw that the Qunari guard was approaching, with Bastar himself alongside him, starting fights you can't finish. Take away your mages and your slaves and your blood magic, and you're all soft. The guard put a hand to his blade, but Bastar grabbed his hand. He looked at Mirian and smiled, then shook his head. "Now get up and work," Strife muttered, leaning in. Mirian lunged to his feet, ramming his head up and catching the surprised elf in the gut. As Strife staggered back, Mirian punched him again and again. "No slave would talk like that," he said, breath hitching from effort as he brought his fists together to smash down on Strife's head. "Whoever you are, you're a fraud. And as soon as I tell the guards—" Strife's forearm, lean with long ropey muscle, slapped Mirian's fists aside, and his other fist hammered Mirian's chest just below the breastbone, stealing his breath. As he stumbled, Strife caught him by the shoulder and leaned in. "And people say I talk too much," he said. And then his other hand came in with a blow Mirian saw coming but couldn't do anything about, and the world exploded into light and then darkness. As the world slid away, he heard the Qunari laugh. The Qunari guards had beaten Strife afterward, of course, but it had been a perfunctory beating, to make sure he knew that there'd be more of the same if he talked back or caused more trouble. Later the guards dragged him and the unconscious Mirian, still chained to him at the ankle, to a makeshift shelter where the prisoners were secured for the night. The guards came around with bowls filled with some sort of savoury porridge, and Strife shovelled it into his mouth. Beside him, Mirian, finally awake, sniffed at it and grimaced. "Not up to your fancy tastes?" Strife asked, shaking his head. "Shut up." Mirian glared at him and then took a bite, chewing more than he needed to, with a sour look on his face. "That's the spirit. Eat hearty. You've got a full day's work ahead of you." The shelter was open on one side to let what passed for a breeze flow through and cool down the prisoners. Strife had a good view of the forest in the distance. The greens of the mossy trunks and heavy leaves darkened to black in the dim grey starlight. As he ate, a pale white form separated itself from the forest. It was a halla, antlers curling out like Tevinter sabres. It scented the air, one foreleg raised. When it saw Strife looking at it, the halla tapped the ground slowly and deliberately 3 times. Strife shook his head and tapped his leg twice. The halla ducked its head down. Then it turned back into the forest, gone as quickly as it had arrived. What was that? Strife looked over at Mirian, whose eyes were narrowed in thought. What was what? That deer. It was like you talked to it. Don't be silly, Strife said, smiling and cracking his knuckles. It was a deer. I shooed it off so it wouldn't end up in the porridge. No, those white ones are, Mirian thought. Halla. That's what the Dalish elves used to pull their wagons. Is it? Strife downed another spoonful of the porridge. It wasn't bad once you started thinking of it as lukewarm stew after your brothers had already gotten the good parts. You know that's what it was, Mirian glared. Is that what you are, one of those Dalish bandits? Seems to me, Strife murmured, putting his bowl down, if I were chained to one of those Dalish elves, the ones willing to kill any shem who looks at them wrong, I'd watch my mouth, because that Dalish elf might be here secretly, and he'd have to kill anyone who gave him away. Mirian opened his mouth and then looked up guiltily as the guard stopped in front of them. "Bowl," said the guard, a thick Kunari warrior who seemed to be made of scar tissue and knee skin. "Now!" Mirian looked at Strife. Strife raised an eyebrow, curling one hand into a fist where Mirian couldn't see. Mirian passed the bowl to the guard. "Thank you for supper." Strife did the same, head down to hide his grin. When the guard had moved to the next chained pair, he looked at Mirian. "Thank you for supper? That how the slaves talked in your manner?" "I didn't—" Mirian caught him, then glowered. "Threaten me again and you'll find my tone quite different." "Don't worry." Strife lay back on his pallet, using his arm as a makeshift pillow. "Tomorrow I'll be away from here, and you'll be chained to someone new." "Is that so?" Mirian asked. Strife wasn't sure whether the man sounded angry or curious. Maybe both. "You'll see." He shut his eyes and went to sleep with the ease of long practice sleeping in uncomfortable places. The Kunari came early in the morning to wake them all, and Strife pulled himself up, as did Mirian, who was groaning and whining exactly like a good slave wouldn't. Whatever he'd been before the Kunari conquered Ventus, it hadn't involved getting up early. "I must speak to Bastar," Strife said when the guard started to unchain them from the main chain line. "There is other work I should be doing." The guard, a burly Kunari whose face looked like something a Tevinter noble saved for his dogs at the end of the day, stared down at Strife. "You cut the trees." His hand moved slowly to the cudgel at his waist. Strife nodded. "Yes, but Bastar will want me to do something else when I speak with him." Mirian was shifting nervously beside him. The little man would already be trotting off with an axe he didn't know how to use, ready to make some new blisters. So would Strife, if he'd been 30 years younger, looking up at a human guard. Hurry along so the guards didn't notice you, and maybe you'd get through the day without trouble. "Wir Borassen," Strife thought, keeping his eyes on the guard. It was one of the first things the Dalish had taught him, the way of the bow. As the sapling bends, so must you. In yielding, find resilience. In pliancy, find strength. The guard finally looked away. "Come," he muttered, and walked off. Strife moved to keep up, and Mirian, with a muttered oath, also hurried to keep pace. "What are you doing?" the human muttered as they walked across the beach toward the Kunari command tent. "Don't worry. In a few minutes it won't be your problem." Bastar looked up from papers as the guard came in. When he saw Strife and Mirian, the smile he gave made Strife think of cracking knuckles. "What do the Bass need?" Strife bowed. "I am trained in alchemy. I worked with another elf. He called himself Thuntiel." Bastar snorted, the gold paint on his face wrinkling, but he seemed interested despite himself. "We do not know the names of the Bass." "He has marks upon his face." Strife touched his cheeks. "Like branches. He is also trained in alchemy. Together we could help with more than cutting down trees." "Ah," Bastar smiled, slow and easy. "I know this Bass. He also talked too much." "Bend but never break," Strife remembered. "Put me with him then," he said, "and I will see to it that he is quiet." Bastar looked at the guard and said something in the Kunari language. He turned to Strife. "You will go to the other elf now. You will work as he does." His smile curved like a sword built for chopping. "The Qun is generous in fulfilling such requests." Strife ducked his head. "My thanks, bastard." Mirian's elbow dug into his side, but Mirian was a whiny little man who wouldn't be Strife's problem for much longer. The guard led them across the beach toward another large tent. Strife walked easily, watching as the other prisoners set to work with axes. The dull thumps of axes cutting into wood were a little drum beat under the constant foamy song of the ocean waves crashing against the shore. "I don't like this," Mirian muttered beside him. "The Qunari don't change their minds like that. I took classes in this. They think everyone is born to do a certain job, and they don't just let you change your mind because you complain about it." "Wishing you let them know you were a scribe and not a labourer?" Strife asked. "Listen, you knife-eared idiot, you're causing trouble, and I don't want to get caught in it too." "In a few minutes we'll be chained to different people, and you'll never have to worry about me again," Strife said. In a few minutes he'd be with Thantiel, who'd signalled that he'd gotten his hands on the Qunari plans right after Ventus had fallen. Then he and Thantiel would be off into the woods, waiting for a certain Halla to show up and guide them to safety. And a few hours after that, he'd be singing old elven songs around a campfire, with Thantiel warbling on the high notes and Irilin telling him that his accent was still terrible after all these years. They would laugh about the Qunari and about idiot Tevinter men who'd never learned to stand up for themselves with blood magic and slaves to support them, and Strife would turn the shackles into a lovely decoration on his quiver. The guard opened the flap to the tent, and Strife and Mirian stepped inside, their chain clanking between them. The smell hit Strife first, hot lye and sweaty steam, and as his eyes adjusted he realized that it was the stink of laundry. Robed figures were dumping dirty clothes into vats and stirring the clothes around. Not the alchemists, then, Strife realized. Their robes were different from the prisoner's uniform he'd gotten, and they didn't match each other either. Some robes were slim, while others hid the figures inside them behind voluminous folds. If they hadn't been mindlessly beating the clothes, Strife would have thought the prisoners were chantry priests. "Where's Thantiel?" Strife asked the guard, stepping into the room. Enclosed like this, it would be even easier for the two of them to escape once the guard left. Strife looked around, squinting against the acrid steam, and saw a tall, slim figure who wasn't wearing robes. "Thant, that you?" Thantiel didn't answer, and Strife went to him, Mirian trotting behind with awkward, jittery steps. "Wait," the human was saying. "Wait, this isn't right." Strife caught Thantiel's shoulder and turned him around. The eyes, the bright blue eyes of an elf who had never known the pain and indignity of living in an alienage, met Strife's stare. They were dull and glassy and devoid of recognition. Thantiel's mouth hung open, and he swayed in Strife's grasp, a vacant weight. The Valasleen tattooed across his face, a mark of adulthood for those raised in the Dalish clan, was the only remnant of Strife's friend. "The robes," Mirian hissed. "These were mages." Strife turned and saw another worker who was dragging a wooden hamper across the sand. Her eyes were flat and empty, just like Thantiel's, but her robe, filthy and sodden as it was, still glittered at the hem with remnants of gold trim. What did the Qunari do to the mages they took prisoner? Strife tried to remember, and then cursed himself for a fool as a blow cracked across his back and brought him to his knees. "This bass also spoke too much."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?